All right, folks, we have been reading and talking about fairy tales, and we've said that fairy tales all have certain characteristics in common. They may not have all of these, but they will generally have some of them. And some of the things that they may have include magic, threes and sevens. That means you may have three characters or seven characters, or something's done three times or something's done seven times. You're generally always going to have good versus evil, a good guy against a bad guy. That's what makes the story so interesting. Oftentimes, you will have royalty, talking animals, and of course, magic. So, as we read our fairy tale today, we want to look and see if we have any of these elements in it. Now, I think I told you that fairy tales were usually told orally. That meant word of mouth. This wasn't like your mom or dad would pick up a book and read it to you. Instead, they would tell you stories that they were told when they were growing up. And then when you had children of your own, you would tell them the stories you had heard when you were growing up. And then your kids would one day tell their kids, and so on and so forth. Well, we said that this made the fairy tales sometimes change a little bit over time, and it also caused some fairy tales to be lost because maybe someone didn't have any children to tell the fairy tales to that they'd heard growing up. So two men, two brothers, Jacob and William Grimm, went around all of Europe collecting fairy tales. The way they did this was they would go into a village, they would find the older men and older women in the village, and they would just ask them, what were the stories that your parents told you when you were growing up? And then they would write them down. Of course, this took them a long time, but the benefit was that after they had put these fairy tales into a book and published them, people all over Europe could read different fairy tales. They might hear versions of a fairy tale that they grew up with that was a little different from what they had heard. Or they might hear fairy tales that they had never heard of in their life because maybe they lived in France and they got to hear a fairy tale from Italy or from Germany or Spain. Now, the fairy tale I want to read to you today, you may be a little familiar with because it is actually the basis for a movie that came out a little while ago. If you've seen the movie Tangled, then you're probably somewhat familiar with this fairy tale, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you that there are some major differences between the movie Tangled and the fairy tale that it's based on, Rapunzel. So today I'm going to read you the original version of the fairy tale Rapunzel, and I think that you'll enjoy it. As I do read it, look for these elements: magic, threes and sevens, good versus evil, talking animals, royalty. We might not have all of them, but we want to see which ones we do have. Here we go, Rapunzel. Once upon a time, there were a man and a woman who, more than anything in the world, wished for a baby. And one day, to their excitement, they found out they were going to have a baby. They were thrilled beyond belief. Now, this couple lived next door to an old witch. And this witch had a beautiful garden. And this garden was surrounded by a high wall. But when this couple went up into their bedroom, they could look over the wall and see the beautiful plants and flowers and vegetables and fruits that grew there. So it became a habit with the woman that she would go up to her room and look out the window and look at all these beautiful plants. And as she looked, she began to want some of those beautiful vegetables to eat. And as she thought about it more and more, it was the only thing that she could have in her mind. She couldn't think of anything else except those beautiful vegetables and how much she wanted to have some of them to eat. And as she thought about this, she grew pale and thin and sick, and her husband became very concerned and asked her, "What's wrong? What can I do to help?" And she said to him, "Oh, if only I could have a taste of the beautiful lettuce in that garden. If I could just make a lovely salad, I would be so content." And since he loved his wife very much, although he was afraid of the witch who owned the garden, late one night he crept over the wall and brought back a basket full of lettuce for his wife. She made a wonderful salad and ate it all up. And for a few days she was content. But then after a while she looked out the window again and noticed all the beautiful lettuce growing in the garden. And more than anything, she wanted another salad. So her husband went back. In the middle of the night, he crept over the wall, cut some of the lettuce, put it in his basket, and was just about to go back home when all of a sudden he heard, "Stop, thief! What are you doing climbing over my wall like a robber? How dare you? You shall pay for what you've done." Of Of course, the man was terrified, and he fell to his knees and he begged the witch, "Please, please have mercy on me. My wife is going to have a baby, and when she saw your lettuce, it was all that she wanted in the world. Please have mercy on me." At the mention of a baby, the witch's attitude changed completely. And she smiled at the man and said, "Oh, well, in that case, you can have as much as you like. Take it, come back as often as you want. But in return for this favor, you will have to do something for me." The man was so fearful, he agreed without question, took the lettuce, went to his wife, and let her have her salad again. A few days later, of course, she wanted more. And this time the man didn't have to creep over the wall. He went boldly because now he had the witch's permission and invitation to do so. After many months, the witch came to him one day when he was in the garden and said, "It's time now for us to think about what you owe me." Of course, the man thought it wouldn't be anything that was too big or too important. And after all, he'd already given his word. And the witch smiled at him and said, "In return for my kind generosity to you and for sparing your life, you will give me your child." The man was horrified. He couldn't believe what the witch was asking of him. He begged her to change her mind, to reconsider. He offered her what little money he had. He offered his horse. He offered his life even. But the witch was steadfast and would not change her mind. The only thing she would accept as payment was the man's child. So sadly, he took the lettuce and went back home. A few days later, his wife gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. And as soon as the baby was born and gave her first cry, the witch appeared and said, "Now it's time for payment." And she took the child. She ignored the pleading and the crying and the begging of the man and woman, and she took that beautiful newborn baby girl away to raise as her own. After about 12 years, as this girl was growing, the witch decided that a child this beautiful must be locked away from the whole world, because she was fearful that one day when this child grew up, she might marry and then leave the witch. So the witch took this girl, whom she had named Rapunzel, which is the German word for lettuce, out into a thick, dark forest. And in this forest was a tall, high tower with no doors and only one window at the very top of the tower. The witch took Rapunzel and locked her in this tower. And every day the witch would come and visit her. And she would stand outside the window and call out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your golden hair." For Rapunzel's hair had never been cut, and it was so long that Rapunzel could drape it out the window and the witch could climb up it like a rope or a ladder. And thus the witch did, day after day, for several years. Rapunzel, in the meantime, was sad and lonely, being by herself all day with no one but the witch to come and visit her. And so to occupy her time, to keep herself from becoming bored, she would oftentimes sing. And it turned out that Rapunzel had a beautiful singing voice. And one day as she was singing, a prince happened to be riding through the forest, and he heard the most beautiful, most angelic singing he had ever heard in his life. And he decided he'd have to find out who this voice belonged to. So riding through the forest, he came upon a lonely high tower. And he realized that's where the singing was coming from. He rode round and round the tower, looking at every crack and every crevice, trying to find a way inside, but there was none. And he went home sadly. But after a few days, all he could think about was that beautiful voice and hearing that wonderful singing again. So, day after day, he would ride out into the forest. He would go to the tower, stand outside it, and listen to Rapunzel singing. Well, it so happened one day, as he was approaching the tower, he noticed someone else hurrying that way. And so he stopped in his tracks and ducked behind a tree and watched as the witch walked straight up to the tower, stood below the high window, and cried out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your golden hair." And he watched in amazement as a long braid of beautiful golden hair was flung out the window, and the witch climbed straight up that hair and into the tower. He waited until she left, and he went back for many days watching, and he realized the witch only came during the daytime. So he decided to visit at night. And one night, in the dark and quiet, he crept up to the tower, stood below the window, and cried out just as the witch had cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your golden hair." And Rapunzel did. He climbed up the hair and into the tower. Well, Rapunzel was shocked and amazed and very rightly scared to see a strange and unknown man suddenly in her room. But the prince smiled, and he talked to her kindly, and he explained how he had been hearing her singing and how he fell in love with her just from the sound of her voice. And he asked if he might come and visit her again sometime. So, of course, Rapunzel agreed. And every night, the prince would ride through the forest to the tower and would cry out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your golden hair." To which Rapunzel would let her hair out the window. The prince would climb up, and they would spend time talking together. They spent many, many days visiting in this way, and eventually the prince decided that he had never met a more kind or beautiful or sweet woman in his life, and he asked Rapunzel if she would be his wife. She was thrilled and said yes, but the two of them immediately realized they had a problem. How could Rapunzel ever leave this tower? But Rapunzel was not only beautiful and smart and sweet, she was also very, very clever. And she said to the prince, "If you will bring me a strong silk cord every day, I can weave those together and make a ladder, which I can drape out the window and climb out and be your wife." So the prince agreed. And day after day, he would come to visit, bringing a strong silk cord every day. And Rapunzel worked diligently on the ladder that she was going to make in order to escape. But one day, Rapunzel grew rather careless. The witch had come to visit, and as she was climbing up Rapunzel's hair, Rapunzel thoughtlessly said to the witch, "Why does it take you so long to climb up when the prince can come up so quickly?" As soon as she said it, she realized her mistake, but it was too late. The witch looked at her in rage and screamed at her, "You wicked, wicked child! I brought you here to keep you safe from the world, and you have betrayed me." And the Rapunzel begged and pleaded. The witch grabbed her by the hair and chopped off her long, beautiful braid, drug Rapunzel out into the forest, and left her all alone in a dark, deserted place. Then the witch went back to the tower, and she waited, because now she knew her revenge was not complete until she had punished the prince as well. So, the prince rode to the tower that night as usual, stood beneath the window and called out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your golden hair." And, just as usual, a thick golden braid came cascading out the window. He quickly climbed up, but to his shock, it was not the beautiful Rapunzel he found, but the evil witch. And she cackled at him evilly and said, "Ah, you thought to find your lovely bride, but the bird has flown the nest. The cat has chased her away, and now it will scratch out your eyes." In his fear, the prince jumped out the window and thus saved his life. But as he fell, he landed into a bramble of thorns and briars that were so sharp that they pierced his eyes and blinded him. And in despair and pain and grief, he wandered away into the woods. Day after day, he would wander, having nothing to eat but berries and roots that he could find. And this went on for a year, until finally one day, as he was wandering through the forest, he heard a beautiful voice singing, a voice that he recognized. And walking toward the voice, he called out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel!" And hearing the prince, Rapunzel ran to him. He was tattered and bruised and bloodied and scraped. His clothes were in rags, but she loved him just the same. And she fell on him and cried tears of grief at the pain he had suffered, and 2 of those tears fell on his eyes and healed him of his blindness. Then the prince and Rapunzel went off to the prince's castle. They married, and the 2 of them lived happily ever after. The end. So, let's think about some of the elements we may have seen in this particular fairy tale. Of course, we saw good versus evil. The Wicked Witch versus Rapunzel and the Prince. Did we see any magic? Absolutely. We had a witch, so we know we had some magic there. What about 3s and 7s? Well, we had 3 characters, didn't we? 3 main characters. The Prince, Rapunzel, and the Witch. Maybe if you think, you can come up with some more examples of 3s and 7s. Did we see any talking animals? No, there were no animals in this story. Did we see royalty? Yes, we saw a prince. So like we've said, a fairy tale will usually have some of these elements. Maybe not all, but at least some. Now I hope that you enjoyed this fairy tale, and if you'll tune in tomorrow, we'll read another one.